If you're a business owner with your contact details out, you've probably received a cold call at least once, depending on how long you've been in business. And for a lot of people starting out businesses without an audience, without anything to go with, they have to find different ways to find people who might be interested in what they have to offer. And cold calling is one of those ways they do this. We've not talked about this on the podcast, like I was telling today's guest. And today, we'll talk about cold calling. We'll talk about our guest product, which is a dialer for cold calling. And then we'll just talk about generally marketing your business. So today's guest is Aidan Sowa. And welcome to the show, Aidan.
Yeah, good to be
Thank you
on.
so much. So, can you just tell us, before we start talking about all the things I talked about, can you tell us a bit about yourself and what and about your business?
Yeah, so essentially, it's just a dialer software. What we do is parallel dialing, so multiple lines
Hmm.
dialing different numbers at the same exact time. And we figure out exactly how many lines are needed in order to maximize the number of people picking up the phone while minimizing the number of people hanging up the phone. And in terms of like myself, this is one of my third company so far. Prior to that, I ran like a marketing
Okay, so
agency.
parallel dialing. So, for instance, let's say I'm a sales rep and then I have your products. So I could have maybe like four, five, six or more numbers dialing at the same time. That's what you mean, right?
Yeah, our software actually
Ooh.
goes up to 14 different lines, and it really just depends on like how many maximum pickups. So we've tested this across different industries. So what we see is like, for example, reaching out to homeowners, which is pretty common with like real estate and solar and those types of stuff. Typically speaking, we see like around 7 lines is like the pretty optimal number. And then with reaching out to business owners tend to be a little bit harder to crack in terms of like getting responses. So we see around headlines is usually needed for optimal responses. And then for really difficult stuff, I would define that as B2B, like SaaS, like those types of people, or venture capitalists. Venture capitalists are very difficult to kind of get on the phone. 14 lines is pretty needed. But what we optimize for is anywhere from 19 to 30 seconds. Like essentially, we have like a pickup every
Hmm,
time.
interesting. So how this works is, let's say you have a pickup once, that means the rest stop dialing, right? Or something like that. Okay.
No, no, not
I'm still
exactly.
trying to get the picture.
So a pickup, yeah, a pickup is just someone answering the phone. So our dialer is dialing multiple different numbers, and every like so let's just say your conversation goes on for like an average of like 30, 60 seconds. Conversation ends, and then at the end of the call you would put the result of the call. So like, okay, the person was interested, not interested, whatever, and you want to just quickly do that. And after that, the system just starts dialing again, and around 19 to 30 seconds later you're connected with someone again, and they're talking to you and they're like, hello, who is this? And then boom,
Hmm.
another 19, 30 seconds later you're connected. So you're getting connected with around 50 people per hour on average, sometimes more depending on the industry, but we're usually seeing around at least 50 people you're getting connected with. Like, these are real live people you're getting connected with, and we have like a whole AI component beyond that which allows us to be able to detect voicemails and so on, so that way you're only getting connected to real people. But that's it in like
Hmm,
a
interesting.
nutshell,
So what led you
essentially.
to focus on this field? You said you have a couple of other businesses before. So what led you to focus on building a dialer?
Yeah. It was always my goal to start some sort of software, and this one just kind of came across to me by accident in a way. It was mostly came out of my own personal frustration with using dialer softwares, and I took that and I was like, okay, how do I make this better? Because clearly, like, my biggest frustration was the fact that most iOS softwares out there, their numbers burn out. So that's really annoying. If like you're calling, it takes a bunch of time and energy to do these cold calls. So if you're going to be doing that, you want to at least be getting connected with actual people. You don't want to be sitting there for hours just to get connected to nobody, only get connected with like 5 or 6 people an hour. that's not a very good efficiency in terms of use of time. So I came out there, I was like, okay, how do I solve this issue? Because my sales reps hate it, and they really just don't like that. So like they're like, with this cold calling stuff doesn't work. I would hear from people saying like cold calling is dead, and I was just like, I don't know if that's really true. I just think that people aren't doing it right. So I spent a lot of time, and eventually I came across like the idea of like parallel dialing, but we have like a rotating system. So we have like hundreds of numbers rotating in order to keep the numbers healthy. Because a lot of people don't know this, but the average number out there, essentially, if you call more than 50, 55 times in a single day, you can get flagged as spam. And there's these different things like Truecaller ID and other platforms which can flag your phone number as spam. And the second you hit that, like that's it. You're not ever, no one's ever answering your phone ever again. And that's, you're doomed. And unfortunately, a lot of providers out there don't even know this or like don't mention it. And so people who are using it are extremely frustrated and end up quitting the software because they aren't
Okay,
getting
so there's
results.
something you mentioned that a lot of people feel cold calling is dead, but they are not just doing right. And you mentioned one thing that one change you made, which is cycling the numbers so that they don't make above 50 calls in an hour, right? An hour or so, yeah. So what are other ways that other things that people aren't doing right in cold calling?
I would say you have to also minimize the number of hangups. So, like the number of people actually hanging up the phone when you're dialing, essentially you have to be able to minimize it. So, what I mean by that is, let's just say you're calling multiple lines at the same time, like we are. You have to have it so that way the other lines you aren't getting connected with multiple people at the exact same time. Like you don't have people in the queue who are hanging up because it's legally speaking, you're only supposed to have it at 3% or below. There's a law by like the TCPA, which essentially says that you can't have a higher than 3% hang up rate on multiple lines. So we have like a system to be able to reduce that. And it's all about just analyzing it. So figuring out like, okay, 5 lines, 7 lines, 10 lines, etc. How many lines is optimal in order to reduce the pickup rate? But it really is as simple as just not doing too many calls per number. It's about protecting, keeping your numbers clean, and then I guess beyond that is not sounding like super spammy, because if you sound like really, let's just say you're reaching out to something like debt collection or something like that, those types of industries could be more risky in terms of like people marking you as spam, because if people do that on their end, then that's also going to reflect pretty negatively on you. So you gotta not, like, if you're in one of those industries, I would say you'd have to do like around maybe 30 30
Hmm.
numbers per hour, I would say, or per day rather, on a pickup, because you don't want to like have, you want to have the numbers constantly rotating, and that's just the way it has
Okay,
to be.
so now for business owners, a lot of business owners, a couple of business owners are comfortable on the phone. That's unlike me. I barely pick my phone or use my phone, so I'm not one of them. I'm not one of them. So for business owners who love using their phones and maybe they've heard about what you said about cold calling and there being the right way and everything, what would you say is the first? Okay, you have a phone. What's the first technology investment they should make to get started with cold calling?
Data. You definitely need a ton of data in terms of people's mobile numbers. That's another key thing, is that people buy into like office landline numbers and they're dialing all these numbers. The truth is, like, that business owner hasn't used their landline number in years. So you're dialing this number which doesn't even, like, nobody's even answering. And then they're wondering why the pickup rate's like 1 to 2%, because that's the
Wow.
average right now with landlines when you're dialing businesses. So it just doesn't work. In the past, if you go back to like the 1990s, 1985, etc., I wasn't dialing personally at that time, but based on the data and based on the people I've spoken to, the pickup rate was around 30 to 40%. So the landlines have just greatly decreased in the overall pickup rate. With mobile numbers, you're seeing around like a 10% pickup rate. So you want to really pay money for like mobile numbers. It's more expensive, but you definitely want to have mobile numbers with like the person's name, last name, ideally like their LinkedIn profile, so that way you have like more details on them. But at least their first name, last name, plus their mobile number. And if you're calling homeowners, it's a little bit different. Sometimes you could get away with like landlines. because that might be the exact number which they might have connected with their house. But when it comes to business owners reaching out to other like business owners, you 100% need mobile numbers. Every single person who I know who has said to me like, "Hey, cold calling is dead," was calling landlines. I don't know a single person who is calling cell phones who actually
Okay,
who has
so I
that
think the
comment.
data first of all, calling like I said, mostly mobile numbers. So where was the what are the best sources for getting this data?
There's a number of different sources out there. One of them is this platform. It's called Rocket Reach. Um, that's one platform where you can acquire data. There's also Apollo. Apollo's another one you could get data from. Zoom Info is another one. Lucia. There's tons of different providers you can get for phone data. I would say for like the cheapest phone data, like in terms of like most people don't want to spend a ton of money on like mobile numbers. Ideally, you want to reduce your costs. Contact Out can be pretty good. There's this other platform. It's called Lead Magic. Not a lot of people have heard of it, but Lead Magic has like this promotion on their site. It's on AppSumo, which is like a site where you get discounts. And if you go to AppSumo, you can get around, I think it's like 500 credits per month or something, or 1,000 credits per month if you pay for their lifetime deal, which is usually, I think it's like a couple $100 or something, but it's totally worth it because then every single month after that, you're going to get mobile numbers just on autopilot, and you could take those numbers and then use that. So essentially, it populates based on someone's like LinkedIn, and it fills and enriches that data and gives you their mobile number. So if you have like their LinkedIn email, which you could get off of different sources such as Apollo for like pretty cheap, then you can essentially enrich that data with something like Lead Magic, get it for really cheap. I think right now it's like around like 15 cents or something per 1,000 mobile numbers. And if you did that, then you would have very, very cheap mobile numbers. And that's typically what I recommend. Lead Magic is very good in that regard. We also have like our own like data sources which are like cheaper than that. So if someone wanted to do that, I don't want to necessarily promote that, but like we can help people get like cheaper data than even Lead Magic. But Lead Magic is technically the cheapest out there on the market, but we offer like more cheaper alternatives to like
Amazing.
customers.
So
Yeah.
Lead Magic, Contact Out, Apollo, Rocket Reach, and you too. So now for you talked about this sources of data and code. So for a business owner still maybe wanting to start a cold calling campaign for their business, what would you say is a realistic investment they would make to start out? Software, everything, at least to get the first results.
Yeah, so in terms of realistic investment, I would say it depends on how many cold callers you're using. If it's just you, then it's pretty minimal because you have a cold calling software that if you're just doing like you're just yourself, that's like 250 or so a month. Or if you're just doing power dialing, which is just like a couple numbers or so like at a time, then you're looking at an even small investment, maybe like 150, $100 or so a month. Then you've gotten that taken care of. Then you go on to the data. The data you can spend anywhere from I would say realistically speaking, you'd want to budget at least like $500 or so a month just for data, so that way you can get really high quality data. And $500 would be pretty decent. So like around I would say realistically speaking, and then you also gotta to verify the mobile number. So even though you quote unquote get mobile numbers and stuff, you gotta validate that these are actual mobile numbers and not landlines. Because these particular systems, for example, such as Lead Magic, such as these other ones, even though they give you mobile numbers, they're not
Hmm.
necessarily real mobile numbers. So you have to validate them. And there's different sites out there. One of the favorites, which I like to use, is this platform called Real Validito, and it's really useful to verify these numbers. And it's very cheap. It's around I think like $60 or $70 to be able to verify that around 100,000 numbers that these numbers are legitimate and real. So it's very cheap to figure out like okay these numbers are real. So you want to clean that list. And once you have all of that, then you're ready to send. And I guess beyond that, if you're hiring people, like, right, if you want to hire like actual cold calls to do it and you don't want to be wasting time yourself doing the cold calling, that's an additional cost as well. So if you want to do that, there's two options. One, I've seen people do stuff like outsource, such as from like Egypt or such as from um, many different places where you're able to get dialers for reduced costs, and there's other people who want to actually hire them in-house, like have like a physical call center. That option actually could be pretty effective, but in those cases you have to have additional costs, right? You got to pay for like a new computer for these people, like an actual, and you also have to pay for an office space, and then you also like have to pay for internet. There's a bunch of different costs involved there. But if you're just hiring overseas, for example, you could typically get a caller for like around, I would say, like 700, 800 or so a month, realistically speaking. But I like, we have several clients that do the actual office thing, and they are all in. Like one guy who's a client of ours, he has like 9 agents. He's paying around $50,000 a month across everything. So that's a pretty substantial cost, but he easily makes back the money because he's in like in a space where the average deal size is around like 23,000 to
Amazing. So I
40,000.
think that's a very comprehensive answer. I think that will lead me to the next question, which should be time. How long would a typical business owner, on average, expect to wait before they can start seeing a return on their cold calling investments?
So I would say it depends on the offer. Everything kind of comes back to the offer, right? So if you don't have a good offer, you might never get results. You need to actually have like a good offer. It needs to be proven in terms of like people have to genuinely be interested in your offer to an extent. This software is not magic. I can't get someone who's like some people to like suddenly be interested in stuff which they're not. Your niche actually has to be interested. But assuming that's the case, and assuming you're reaching out to the right people in terms of mobile numbers, then typically speaking, what we're seeing is a booked call every like 200 to 300 calls out, and that means usually in terms of like actually people picking up the phone. Typically speaking, I would say within like an hour or so of cold calling, I would say worst case scenario, you should be getting at least one booked call. So if you're doing like 5 or 8 hours of calls a day, let's just say realistically speaking, maybe like 5 to 10 booked calls per day. You could schedule, and then based on that, you can kind of reverse engineer it. What percentage of these people actually show up to the call? Let's just say it's 50%. Five of those people show up, and then let's just say one of those people sign up. Okay, so that means you're getting one person signed up every single day at whatever price, and then you could essentially reverse engineer those numbers. And I think it's very realistic for someone to get one person signing up per day if they have someone like a cold caller calling every single day. It's very realistic depending on the industry. Obviously, other industries like real estate and stuff like that, it's only realistic to get maybe 3 or 2 particular people interested, but that's okay in those particular industries because those deals are really big. So you're getting like a $30,000-$40,000 deal. It's okay to only get like
Yeah.
5 or 6 of those a month because you're making
Yeah.
it's just a lot more
Okay, so
money.
now for the technology part of cold calling over the past few years, I remember back in the days we had the rotary phones where you turn and you call. I know technology has changed a lot. So, in the cold calling space, how would you say technology has changed, especially in the last few years? I know you mentioned your software has an AI component. So maybe you can also tell us how that works with the entire process.
Yeah, so there's several aspects. For one, everything's in the cloud now. I mean, some people have like softwares they download. Most people don't want to have to download additional stuff on their computer if they don't have to. It's easier just to have everything in the cloud where you can just access everything, whether it's like the call recordings, etc. And it's very simple just to go onto the cloud. And what was the other part? I remember there
Yeah,
was like
so
some other
you
part of the
mentioned
question.
your solution has an AI part to it. So yeah, how does that fit in?
Yeah. Yeah, so like in terms of like the AI part, I mean, we're going to be enabling AI transcriptions and stuff like that into the future. But right now, in terms of like AI, what we do is we optimize in terms of one, the number of people who like, because people go to voicemail. So we have like an AI component on the back end, which allows us to be able to figure out, okay, is this person going to voicemail? Is it not? So we have that in terms of like figuring out like, is the actual person going to voicemail? So you're only getting connected to real actual people, and then beyond that, what you're also getting connected to is real like legitimate people on like an hourly basis and optimize so that way you're not getting a lot of people hanging up and you're getting connected to 100 people without wasting your numbers.
Amazing, amazing. So I think apart from that too, you mentioned earlier about low answer rates and call filtering. So it helps with those too. Because you talked about the voicemail and things like that. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, essentially, you want to only talk to real people because here's a very real issue, which we've seen in other dialers, is that you get connected with someone and you're not even speaking to someone. They like to count it as like a pickup, but you're not even talking to anyone. It's what's referred to in this industry as dead air. And dead air essentially is where you're talking to
Hmm.
no one. You just hear silence. And you're just like, okay, who is this? And sometimes people get a little thrown off by that and they're like, hello, 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 but there's nobody there, and they just have to click
Yeah.
the hang up button and move on. And another thing is sometimes the voicemail detection for like a lot of these companies out there is not so great. So they get connected to their voicemail. They said, and they say this voicemail throws people off as well. That doesn't really count as a pickup. What we optimize for is like real, true pickups on our software, so that way people are getting connected to real, legitimate people. And that's how we have like an AI component, which is able to detect like, okay, this is actually a voicemail because there's so many softwares out there which are using like archaic technology to be able to figure out whether it's a voicemail or not, and they just aren't that accurate. So we essentially solve that
Okay.
entire
So
issue.
now for business owners who have taken up cold calling or intend taking up cold calling, what numbers, what metrics do they need to track to know that they are actually being successful cold calling, and what are the vanity metrics that are maybe just fancy, good to have numbers?
Yeah, so first thing is how many calls are you booking on a daily basis? That's like the most important thing, like how many calls are you actually booking? Next thing is like what percentage of these people actually show up to calls? Like are you getting like a 50% show up rate, like again 60%? Because you want to optimize for as high as possible show up rate as possible. And there's several ways you can go about doing that. You could tell someone like, hey, are you sure like is this 100% like a call you're going to be able to show up on, or is there going to be something potentially which might come up? By saying stuff like that, it ensures like higher show up rate. And then like the final metric would be how many cold calls do I need to make in order to get a closed deal? And that's probably the most important metric because cold calling, let's just face it, is not exactly necessarily enjoyable to do. So if you're going to do it, you want to know at least like, okay, if I put in like 5 8 hours of work, then I like after this amount of calls, I am going to get a deal on average. Or like maybe like some days you'll get like two, but it'll average out to be like one deal per like 8 hours of work. Because once you know those numbers, it's a lot easier to be quote unquote motivated to do the work versus just being blind, because that's literally 80% of the industry. They're blind about their metrics. I asked them, what's your pickup rate? What's like how many people are you talking to on an hourly basis? I asked them like how many like booked calls you're making, how many calls does it take for you to actually get a closed deal? These very basic questions. You even ask this to like some of the larger companies in the world. They simply do not know their metrics, and not just like walking around blind. In my opinion, if you're blind, then you don't know like if
Yeah.
it's working or if it's not working. There's so many things kind of like missing in place, so you want to know your
Amazing. So
numbers.
now, for you mentioned earlier that some businesses, when hiring, would like to have people in house. For others, they would like to hire offshore. But at the end of the day, I think one thing, whether they hire in house or offshore, one thing that's important is training, especially when they're hiring in remote environments. So, what advice would you give to your businesses to
Yes.
effectively train these people they're hiring?
Yeah, I would say the entire training process, you got to allocate, realistically speaking, like 2 3 weeks in order to even train up a new cold caller. And also this particular industry, if you're not hiring in person, like if you're hiring overseas, typically speaking, we see like a higher churn, which means like people quitting the job. So you kind of have to keep hiring these people over and over. Versus if you have people in like a little call center and you have a bunch of people, they get to know each other, eat lunch together, etc. It's more of like a camaraderie, etc. And there's a lot less churn. So if you hire someone, you know they're gonna be there for a while. But when it comes to training the people, you gotta allocate like 2 or 3 weeks, and what that involves is just like going through objections, role playing with them, being like, okay, like how do you handle this? You know, doing like fake calls essentially, back and forth, and that just requires a lot of repetition, which is usually why I like allocate like 2 or 3 weeks, just going through like different cold call objections. Like one of the most common ones, for example, is send me an email. Like, how do you handle that objection? What's the price? I'm too busy, like, call me back another time. Stuff like that, figuring out how to answer every single one of those objections, and then having those script dialed, because people are not stupid. If someone's reading off of a freaking script, they're going to know that it's a script and they're going to hang up. So if you're going to be using a script, you want to have it
Hmm.
almost like memorized, so that way it doesn't come across as a script, and you want to have pretty much your objection handlers more or less memorized and stuff, because the most common like sales like early cold call people, for me, they're very fragile in terms of like they don't know what they're doing if you're hiring someone like who's a little bit less experienced. What I mean by that is if someone says something like I need to think about it, they'll actually take them seriously, and they'll be like, oh, okay, I'll let you think about that, and they hang up and they move on. And that's just not how you go about sales. Or if someone says something like they break at
Yeah.
the first objection and stuff, when in reality it's just a smoke screen, because nobody needs to think about something, they don't even know what it is at this point. So that's just simply illogical. So yeah, just learning how to push past things and figuring out what's like a real legitimate objection. Like, I'll give you an example of a real legitimate objection. Sometimes people are on a Zoom call and they do answer a call, and they say like, hey, I'm on a Zoom right now. That could be a real objection. For me, it blows my mind why someone's answering a phone call while they're on a Zoom, but apparently people do that. So it is like you have to figure out what are the real objections and what are the
Yeah.
actual
Okay.
smoke
So I think in
screens.
this last answer, you talked about the script and importance of memorizing the script. So now, looking at the current 2025, where almost nobody is picking their phones, and the earlier days of cold calling, how has this? How would you say this cold call scripts have changed? And what would you say are some elements of a powerful cold call script for today?
Yeah, so you can't get away with the standard stuff. I don't know if you've
Yeah.
seen like Wolf of Wall Street or like any of these different sales movies. You can't get away with those types of scripts. It just doesn't work. No, like there's the reason for the call, like it just doesn't work. You have to really like get them to commit to a minute. So one of the easiest ones is just like saying like, "Hey, name, you got a minute?" And then like a lot of time people will be curious. They'll be like, "Yeah, I've got a minute," and then going straight into it, be like, "Well, my name is whatever with like XYZ company, and like I'm calling in regards to X." That's one of the more effective like types of scripts. It doesn't have to be complicated. I see a lot of misinformation on the internet. I don't know why it is, but I see a lot of misinformation about people saying stuff like, this is a cold call, would you like to hang up? That does not work. I don't know why there's so many different types of like gurus online who are saying like that's an effective script. It simply does not work. And we've tested it. We've tested pretty much all of these scripts, and it simply is not an effective script. You have to really just be upfront. You have around like 10, 15 seconds or so to get what we refer to as an opener. So in like the cold email space, like, getting someone to open the email, you have to get someone to agree in that first 15 seconds to really consent to that call. So when they say you got a minute and like, yeah, then you've gotten their consent. They're much less likely to actually hang up once they've agreed like that they've got time and stuff. So you want to get their consent, and then you move on into like the actual value statement, and you want to make it quick. And then potentially, depending on the industry, asking them qualifying questions to figure out if they actually are a good quality lead. And if they are, scheduling a time, and then at the end of the call, making sure, be like, hey, John, like you can 100% make this time at like 9 o'clock. Like, and you want to also, here's another key thing is I see people scheduling calls like an entire week in advance and stuff like that. That does not work in general, but especially in cold calling. People forget things like easily, and you want to make sure, ideally speaking, scheduling them later that day or within like an hour, or like worst case scenario the next day. If you're scheduling someone out longer than 24 hours, they're not going to be very committed. So, and then after the cold call and stuff like that, going through these people, in order to actually ensure high show up rates, what we have found, it's very useful to request them on LinkedIn request them on Facebook, pretty much like every social media platform they have. So that way they know you're a real legitimate person. And it's harder for them to just no show you. And sending them like a personalized like text or email to actually show you're like a real legitimate person and provide real value in terms of like case studies and stuff like that. But like because you're selling them on why they should actually show up on the call. Like you might have actually like told them like they might have agreed to it, but if they just see you as some random guy who cold called them, they're not going to necessarily have high commitment. So you need to still continuously sell them on why they should show up to on that call, because the average show up rate, like if you're not doing things correctly, is around like 30%, and you can easily get that show up rate up to like 50, even 70% show up rates. It's definitely possible to get up to 70% if you follow the
I
right
think that's like
steps.
a mini masterclass on this, and I think a lot of people would get a lot of value from the answer you gave for everything. So now coming back to Zoto Dialer, building the business, what are some challenges you had, the biggest challenges, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of like initial challenges, we ran into like some developers and stuff like that, which were not necessarily the best and stuff. But like in terms of like actual challenges, I would say like figuring out our ideal target market was like one of our initial challenges. So figuring out who's like the actual best fit for our software and stuff. But I mean, in a way, I kind of already had an advantage, which is the fact that I was my own ideal customer in a way. Like we used like these types of things, so I already knew people who are already using these types of softwares. So we just had to branch out a little bit in terms of like, okay, certain types of enterprises, and we did a hack in a way to be able to figure out what types of industries are really interested. And this is kind of unconventional, but we went to Reddit and we looked at all the different people who were actually talking about cold calling softwares and looked at we took a note of every single individual subreddit, and we have people like commenting on these different subreddits, etc. And that's a whole nother strategy. But we figured out exactly what types of industries are actually talking about cold calling. And then we went to Google Trends. Google Trends is where you can see like exactly how much search volume which you're getting for a particular keyword. And we looked at that in terms of like what types of industries are even interested in dialogue softwares. And the final aspect is we went to YouTube. So YouTube, you could see when you type in a keyword, it auto populates. So, for example, like how to cold calling, and it adds a potential word which you could type in as a suggestion, and you could see all the different things coming up. So we figured out like, okay, so people are actually typing this stuff up into YouTube, they're typing this stuff into Google, and you could see they're talking about it on Reddit. So clearly there's a demand, and we went after those industries.
Amazing, amazing. So now for other people who have ideas on things to build, things to on tech and products to build to probably make things easier, like you're doing with parallel dialing, and maybe they have some blockers or they're discouraged or anything. What advice would you give to them?
I would definitely look at stuff like look at softwares which are already succeeding. And one of the easiest ways to go about doing that is to look at businesses which are currently being sold. So if you're starting a software business, I would not necessarily come up with like a completely fresh idea unless you like already have like a little bit of proven stuff in the marketplace. I typically look for software ideas which have already been done and are already making at least $50,000 a month, and then going to like different marketplaces online, such as like acquire.com. There's like many of these different websites on marketplaces where you can see actual software businesses getting sold. And from there, once you look at that, then you'll be like, okay, let me look at the reviews of these companies which are being sold. And then you look at the reviews, and specifically, you filter for the 1 star and 2 star reviews, and you look at the complaints. And there's usually a bunch of people complaining about a recurring issue. You write down those particular issues, and you're like, okay, I'm going to launch a software which solves those issues. And then guess what? All those people are going to become like your customers, essentially. And that then boom, you've got like a $50,000 a month business, and very successful because you essentially took a successful business idea and you solve some recurring complaints which these people have, and then you have a successful business, more or less. And then you have to have a developer, and that's a whole nother aspect. You have to have a really good developer, and you got to really vet them.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. So now, for listeners who have listened to this episode and maybe they want to continue the conversation, they want to learn more about cold calling, or they want to use your software, Zoto Dialer, what's the best way for them to reach you?
Yeah, I mean, the best way to reach me, typically speaking, you can reach out to me on Instagram or LinkedIn. And like my username on Instagram is at the Aidan Sowa. On LinkedIn, I believe it's Aidan Sowa as well. And you can also just reach me at the website if they want to figure out specifically about Zoto Dialer. They can go to www.zotodialer.co.
Amazing. So zotodialer.com, Aidan Showa on LinkedIn, and the Aidan Sowa on Instagram.
Yeah, it's
Dot co, yeah,
zotodialer.co,
zotodialer.co.
with
Okay,
the
so that'll
CO.
be on the show
Yeah.
notes at the bottom of the screen for when this episode is live. So thank you so much for coming on the show today and sharing so much, so many tips. I'm actually tempted to start calling after this episode. Thank you. Thank you. And for the listeners, if you've learned something from this episode, feel free to share it with someone else who would learn too from it. And till next week, when we're back with a brand new episode, don't forget to keep taking your business. Bye for now.